All right, friends, I'm going to turn it over to Josh to kick us off tonight.
All right. Hey, everybody. It's good to see everybody. This is exciting to be back together. We had so much success with the Roman study that we were excited to be able to offer it another Bible study like this. And I think one of my favorite things is just seeing so many different ages, and it's so cool to get the variety of our church family together in this setting. So I know Clayton and I are both excited about this particular sermon series. And so what I want to do tonight is just kind of set some context that is foundational to a more broader idea of what we're talking about. My dog is scratching my door and I need to let him out real quick. Welcome to Zoom life. This will literally take 2 seconds. Hold on.
Don't you love Zoom?
Back in business. Okay. Honestly, though, that's kind of part of the appeal of this as well, right? We're all kind of like in each other's homes and it just gets real and authentic. And so, welcome to life in the Fitzpatrick home. It's about to get a little crazier, but we can talk about that later. So setting some foundations for Matthew in general. We're going to talk about there are 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, the first 3, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we call the Synoptic Gospels because they're the most similar to each other. John is in kind of a category of its own, just because it's vastly different in its approach to telling the gospel story. And each one of the gospel authors has a particular audience in mind and a particular motivation for sharing the good news of Jesus Christ. So we see very clearly throughout Matthew's gospel that Matthew is writing to a Jewish audience, and there are symbols all throughout the Gospel of Matthew that tie Jesus to prophecies of the Messiah. So Matthew's primary motivation in writing his gospel, the good news, is to the Jewish audience, the Messiah that you've been waiting for generations, he's here. His name is Jesus. This is him. Let me show you why. And so over and over, we see these prophecies fulfilled, and we see patterns and symbols that are tied directly to Old Testament ideas, so that the Jewish audience would go, oh, yeah, I think you're onto something here. For example, one of the primary characters in the Old Testament is Moses. And there are patterns that we see in Moses's life that we see as Matthew writes it in his gospel are paralleled. So if you listen to my sermon today, I pointed out the pattern of Egypt, water, wilderness, promised land. Those 4 steps: Egypt, water, wilderness, promised land. If you recall, Moses spent time in Egypt. Moses took the Israelites through the water. Moses wandered in the wilderness, and Moses was leading the Israelites to the promised land. Well, very directly in the first few chapters of the Gospel of Matthew, we see this pattern as Jesus spends time in Egypt, as Jesus spends time in baptism in the waters. Immediately after his baptism, he spends time wandering the wilderness. How many days? For 40 days. We see those numbers tied together as well. And then we see Jesus reaching the promised land in Galilee, where he does his ministry. Another example, the Gospel of Matthew. Many scholars, biblical scholars, point out that the Gospel of Matthew seems to be divided into 5 sections or 5 discourses. Now, the Sermon on the Mount is in the first section, but one of the ideas is that Matthew's intent in doing this was that he was drawing a direct parallel between the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books of the Bible, and what Jesus is doing here with this, what we might call the New Covenant. And so another thing that I mentioned in my sermon is just the Beatitudes themselves. We see in the Old Testament, as Moses is speaking on behalf of God and presenting the covenant between God and God's people, we see a list of blessings, of Beatitudes. You will be blessed if you do this. Blessed, 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 blessed. Well, the parallel then we see is Jesus here in Matthew 5 saying, blessed are you, blessed are you, blessed are you. In the Old Testament, that was part of the beginning of the original covenant, or we might say the old covenant now that we're looking backwards through the lens of Christ. And in the New Testament, this is very clearly the beginning of Jesus introducing the new covenant, which is part of what the whole Sermon on the Mount is. This is what it means to be in this new covenant with God. This is what the kingdom of God life looks like. Couple other things I want to point out. Oh, one very clearly is in at the very beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. We see in Matthew chapter 5 that it says that he went up on the mountain. That is a verbatim sentence, phrase, fragment from Exodus chapter 19, when Moses ascends Mount Sinai. Scholars point out that there's only 3 times that that phrase is used in the Old Testament when it's translated into Greek. And all 3 times are when Moses ascends Mount Sinai. So again, intentional language tying Jesus, the Messiah, to Moses, who was the great prophet. Now, in Deuteronomy 18, I'm going to read this one really quickly. It says this: the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me, like Moses, from among you, from your brothers. It is to him you shall listen, just as you desired of the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly, when you said, let me not hear again the voice of the Lord my God, or see this great fire anymore, lest I die. And the Lord said to me, they are right in what they have spoken. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. So even in Moses' lifetime himself, he was speaking of this great prophet who would come from the people of Israel. So for generations, the people of Israel have been expecting this prophet who would be greater than Moses was. Right before Jesus shows up on the scene in the Gospel of Matthew, we see John the Baptist. We see the end of John the Baptist's ministry. I might be mixing this up now with Mark. Either way, the beginning of, we see the end of John the Baptist's ministry and the beginning of Jesus's ministry, as John the Baptist also says, there will be one greater than me who comes after me. Everything points to Jesus being this prophet who is fulfilling the expectation for generations and generations, the new Moses, if you will. And so that sets a real foundation as we talk about the Sermon on the Mount, that this isn't just random sayings. This is the beginning of a new covenant that the people of Israel had been anticipating. And here it was in their midst. And as we hear it through the lens of Matthew, we see these dots being connected. So I'll punt that to Pastor Clayton.
Wow, that was good stuff. That was excellent. Josh, thanks so much. Great information and a great tie-in with Moses. One of my New Testament professors gave us a clue about Matthew that I've always remembered, and Josh really alluded to this, is that Matthew is always asking the question of his readers, of those who are reading and hearing the gospel, will you recognize the real thing if you saw it? That Jesus himself is the good news of God. What's the, people have said, what is the good news? Jesus is the good news. And so when Jesus tells a parable about a man who's searching for a pearl of great price, and when he finds it, he sells everything to have it. He's saying, this is the pearl of great price, that Jesus is, and don't fall for cheap imitations, because they're out there in the world. We fall for all the wrong things, but Jesus is the real thing to attach your life to. So I think that question of reading Matthew's gospel, then everything you read in Matthew, you can kind of see Matthew's making the case. Jesus is the Messiah of God. Jesus is the anointed one of God. So, some people have red letter Bibles. Any of you have red letter Bibles? You have where the words of Jesus are in red. This is one of those sections in the Bible that's just all red, right? Chapters 5, 6, and 7. It's like Jesus goes up on the mountain and then he starts teaching. It's all the words of Jesus. And that's why I think we pay why are they red? Well, they stand out and we pay particular attention to the words of Jesus. And I think if everyone reads the Bible through a lens, and we try to filter our own biases out as we read the Bible, But, if we read the entire Bible through the lens of Jesus and his love, through those red letter words, I think that's a good way to understand how to read the Bible. There's something about, understanding that Jesus is the heart and soul of it, and his words. It's not that other words aren't important. It's just Jesus is the good news. He's the embodiment of that good news, and we need to pay attention when he speaks. Just to give you a little insight on biblical scholars and how they differ. And the end of chapter 4 reads that great crowds followed Jesus from Galilee, the Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and from beyond the Jordan. So you've got people from different nationalities, different religious orientations, following Jesus and wanting they've heard about him as a healer, as a teacher, the wisdom that he speaks with, how they've been afflicted with various diseases and he's cured them. And so they're following him. So then we read that Jesus saw the crowds and goes up on the mountain and sat down. As he sat down, the disciples come to him. That's the first chapter, first verses of Matthew. So here's the I don't know how you picture this setting. I've always pictured it by the Sea of Galilee, probably because I've been there a couple of times, and our guides kind of had us look up at the mountain and see when Jesus would have gone up and spoken to the crowd. Did Jesus speak to the whole crowd, or did he do that? Did he deliver the Sermon on the Mount just to the disciples? There's your biblical controversy for the night. I don't know the answer to that question. It says very clearly his disciples came to him. He began to speak and taught them. Is that just the 12 disciples that he's called? Or is it this great crowd that's been following him that are also in the vicinity of this area? I don't know that it matters. I've always envisioned it as the crowd, that he was talking to the whole multitude of people. But some scholars believe this was kind of a catechism for the disciples, that he was giving them instructions. This is what you are to teach. This is the essence of my message. And so I don't know that it matters that much, because we have the essence of the Sermon on the Mount for us. But I just think it's kind of an interesting debate between scholars. How do you read that in Greek, and then how does that play out? I don't know that it matters if it was just to the disciples or to all of those people that were following him. So I think it's important to know that Matthew was talking as Matthew has taught Jesus talking. He's talking to not just to individuals. This is not just an individualistic gospel. This is a community ethos, if you will, that what Jesus is delivering in the Sermon on the Mount is the way the Christian community, the followers of Christ, are to be in the world. Not just what you do in the world, but this is who you are and how you act in the world. Some people think that the Sermon on the Mount is less about what we do and more about who we are. So that the Sermon on the Mount really is Jesus delivering, this is the identity of the church. This is who you're supposed to be. This is who you're called to be as a group. Now, what Jesus sets out for us is nearly impossible. And next week, we're going to get into him talking about you must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. The Beatitudes alone, if you just take them at an individualistic look, I think pretty much all of us are disqualified right away, right? I mean, if you just look through that list, just right there, you start talking about being merciful and being pure in heart and being peacemakers, being meek, and we don't always act that way, right? Or at least I'll just own this. I don't. Maybe you do, but I don't always act this way. I think Jesus is saying this to the community this is who the Christian community is called to be, knowing that we're not always going to get it right and we're going to struggle. But he sets this high bar. This is what we aspire to be. This is an aspirational goal. This is what we are striving to be. And in terms of how we live our faith and how we live with each other and how we treat those around us. I think it's pretty powerful to think of it that way. Let me just quickly go through some of a few. I'm not going to go through all the Beatitudes, but just to give you an idea. And another word about this is the word, and I gave an outline that I think we emailed you an outline of the Sermon on the Mount that's from the Interpreter's Bible, and it has the word eschatological in it. And eschatology is the study of the last things, and what the writers of that have said is that Matthew is writing to an eschatological community, so that the church, the people who are hearing this message, they are the eschatological community. And that is to say that there is a promised future, but that has already begun in Christ, if that makes sense. It's the already and the not yet, and that we live between the already and the not yet. That's the way I think about this message, is that this is the promise of who we will be, and that being has begun in our relationship with Christ right now. So I think that's you can look that up, that term eschatology, but I think it's somewhere living between the already and the not yet in my mind. So let's look at very quickly at the Beatitudes, and I've covered this in my sermon this morning, kind of verse by verse. So I'm not going to go into detail about all of these, but it's interesting to read the Bible with different translations, and I'll just share a couple of different translations of several of these. Blessed are you who are poor in spirit. The Goodspeed translation, those who feel a spiritual need. I think that's a good translation. Those who feel their spiritual need. Eugene Peterson in the Message translates it, blessed are you when you're at the end of your rope. That's a good way to think about being poor in spirit, when you're at the end of your rope, when you kind of bankrupt, and you're spiritually bankrupt, you have nothing left to give, and you realize that you have a need. And Jesus is saying, how blessed are you when you know you need God? And I think that's again, everything Jesus does in the Sermon on the Mount is turning things really, instead of turning things upside down, he's turning things right side up. He's saying, this is the way, this is what the world says to you, but this is what I say to you. You know, this is what your culture has told you about what matters. Here's what God thinks what matters. So it's not having your act all together, which a lot of us, I've invited people to church before, and they said, well, you know, I'll come to church when I get my life together a little bit. You know, if you know you don't have your life together, that's why you're in church, and why you know you need the church, why you know you need Jesus, is that none of us have our life together fully. And recognizing the poverty in your own spirit, that you have a need that only God can fill, is the greatest blessing of all, because that's the beginning of a journey, when you recognize how deeply you need God. Blessed are you when you mourn. The way Peterson translates that, blessed are you when you've lost what is most dear to you. Only then can you be embraced by the one most dear to you. But mourning, again, I struggled with that understanding for years. Why would Jesus say you're blessed if you mourn? But there's something powerful about knowing that we as a if he's talking to a church community, the community of believers, that one of the things we are called to do is mourn with those who mourn. and grieve with those who grieve. And I think it's one of the most powerful things the church does. And if you've ever been in that situation where you've lost a loved one, you know how important having a community is. And it's little things that people do and say. And sometimes it's just them telling a story about your loved one, or writing you a note, or calling you to check on you, or just saying, I'm praying for you. That those acts of the community lift each other up. And when you mourn, you realize how special and how precious the community of faith is, and how much you need the community of faith. I don't know how people go through life without having a spiritual home, a spiritual connection, because that community is so important. But I've said sometimes that, really for me, what that's come to mean is, how blessed are you that you've shared something so special, and your life begins to turn to gratitude for what you've been given in loved ones that are no longer with us. And you go through a period of mourning it's intense and painful, but hopefully when you come through in a healthy way of mourning, you end up more in gratitude for what you've had and what you've been given. And I think that's the blessing in and of itself, is, how blessed are those who mourn. You find comfort. You find that peace and comfort. Blessed are the meek. In church this morning, in our in-person services, I said, you'd never put this on your resume if you're applying for a job. I'm really good at meekness. You would never put that on a resume. You'd never say, I have a undergraduate degree in meekness, and I've got my master's degree in meekness, and I'm working on a PhD in meekness. Your next company CEO, is not going to have that on his or her resume. I just don't think that's going to be there, because our culture really looks at meekness as weakness. And what I explained in my sermon this morning is that meekness is really about harnessing your will in relation to God's will. That when you give yourself to God, and it's not just about you, that God can then take you and move you and take your strength, but use it in a way that's towards something good. I like the way that Peterson translates this in the Message Bible. He says, you're blessed when you're content with just who you are, no more and no less. So he defines meekness as being content with who you are, no more, no less. I think that's interesting translation as well. And really, even if you are a Greek scholar, all the translations, you really have to really look at different translations to understand the heart and soul of what Jesus is talking about. Because this language is in some ways culturally lost to us, and we're all trying to figure out, what does this mean for our lives today? Then Jesus talks about hunger and thirst for righteousness. He talks about being merciful. I don't know about you, but I grew up, and the motto when I grew up, with the guys I ran around with, was, don't get mad, get even. It was always like, we're going to get revenge. There's going to be payback if you've been wrong. And then Jesus comes along here, and he starts talking about mercy and being merciful, and having a hunger and thirst for what is right in God's eyes, not what's right in my eyes or your eyes, a hunger and thirst for what's right in God's eyes. And then he talks about the pure in heart. And I don't know, that's one of those ones that's like, how do you know you're not working out of your own motive, and you're working really out of a motive to do what God would have you do? And I think that takes a lot of prayer and a lot of searching of your own soul. I think it's one of the reasons it's good to have holy conversations with people in small groups or in with friends that you have accountability with, to really search your own motives in how you live your life. Is it really just about you and manipulating a way to get what you want? Are you really seeking to do what God would have you do? And I think that's what purity of heart. I'm doing a memorial service, graveside service on Wednesday of this week for a man that I first met. He was probably in his early 70s. He just died at almost 101. And he was probably in his early 70s or mid 70s when I became his pastor. And we stayed in touch through the years. And he and I had some really interesting discussions through the years. And one thing I was thinking about with him is that I never doubted where he was coming from in terms of his motive. And I think that's really something to say about someone. I've never doubted that he was really coming from a place of really wanting to do what was right in the eyes of God. And he and I disagreed about a number of issues, and we had good discussions about those issues. But I never doubted where he was coming from in terms of the purity of his agenda, that he really was coming from a place of sincere desire to please God. And isn't that what Jesus is calling for all of us here, is that we operate out of a sincere desire to please God. Jesus talks then about being peacemakers. I said in my sermon this morning, we need more of that in our world today, more people building bridges. Peacemaking is not just about avoiding conflict. It's about doing the hard work of reconciliation. It's about doing the hard work of sitting down and trying to find common ground with people. And I think that's badly needed in our world today. I like what Peterson says, you're blessed when you can show people how to cooperate instead of compete or fight. Show people how to cooperate. That's a good role for the church in the world today. Jesus then talks about persecution, and that you're blessed if you're persecuted for his sake. I'm still trying to wrap my mind around that one. If you've ever been on the receiving end of the kind of persecution they were facing is so different than what we would be facing. But persecution feels very intensely personal when you're the one on the receiving end. And, when you're doing it for the right reasons, it is its own reward. When you're acting, trying to do what you understand God would have you do, you have to understand that's its own reward. So what's the goal? What's the reward of all that? What's the reward of this blessing? Why are we blessed? Because of Jesus. It all points to the person and the role of Jesus. Everything in the Sermon on the Mount points us that this is our reward, and it has already begun in the work of Jesus, and it will be our final reward will be realized in Jesus, but it has already begun. Our reward, our blessing is right now. We can experience the blessing of living in this community where we're striving to live out this Jesus agenda. The last thing I'll talk about is this salt and light, and I need to wrap it up here. But some of you were on a trip we took to the Holy Land, and you'll remember by the Sea of Galilee that several of the cities are on. It's like the Sea of Galilee is in this deep bowl, and then the Golan Heights come up out of that. And it is surrounded by these mountains. The Sea of Galilee is, and on one of those hills, or actually a couple of them, there's a city that's built on that hill. And if this is the site where Jesus is telling the story to the people, he can literally point over across the lake and say, a city built on a hill cannot be hidden. It's up there on that hill. I mean, look over there and see it. You can't miss it. And then he says, so let your light shine. And I talked about the power storm this morning, and just the idea of us being transmission lines, and from one transmission line to another, that power goes. And if we don't let our light shine, we hide it under a bushel, the power can't go on down the line. And that's one of the challenges, I think, of our lives, is to be not only receivers, but transmitters. How do we transmit that love that we've received down the line to others? So this gives us some things to talk about. I think this is one of the most challenging teachings. All through the Sermon on the Mount, you will be challenged, because Jesus sets a high bar of aspiration on how we then try to live into this, not only as a community, but as individuals. How do we set our course to really seek to be this people of God, who are following in the words of Jesus in the way that we live with each other?